one argument that does come up a lot, and this seems to be a stumbling block for a lot of people and wanting to believe in God and Christianity, is that 6 days of creation. So God created the world in 6 days. And you'll hear people say 6 24-hour periods versus evolution, which was the earth is billions of years old. The earth is billions of years old. So how do we reconcile that? And so you've always had this debate of evolution versus creation. Good morning, Pastor Jamison.
Good morning.
We are back again for another episode of You Can't Ask That. So, good drive down?
Great. I spend time on the phone, drink coffee, sleep a little bit. Yeah, it's great.
I don't think that's a good thing if you're sleeping on the way down. You know?
Sorry.
I mean, I've ridden with you. I can understand that you do that, but no, I see you're wearing your Bengals orange today.
Yes, by the time this podcast drops, the Bengals will either be at home listening to it, maybe, or they'll be preparing for their second playoff game. So I don't know. It's been like 31 years or something since they've won a playoff game. So I thought I would rep.
Good deal. Well, you know, being in Kentucky, the only thing that exists down here is Kentucky basketball. So I don't even know who the Bengals are playing.
Yeah, I see a lot of blue when I come to Kentucky.
As you should.
Yep.
And even if you're not a Kentucky fan, don't say it while you're here.
I would never. Especially don't say you're a Louisville Cardinal fan, right?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
Your tires slashed or worse.
Or worse, yeah. All right.
I'm learning.
Well, good. Well, so today I'm pretty excited about today's episode because we're going to kind of start to dig into the Bible a little bit, and I thought we'd just start right there at the beginning and talk about the creation story and dive into that a little bit. But before we do, last episode I had mentioned a law in Kentucky about wearing ice cream, or in Lexington about wearing,
yes,
you can't have an ice cream cone in your back pocket.
Yeah. What'd you find out?
I actually have an answer for you. Now, this comes from my wife, so I don't know if it's true, but being that it's my wife, I'm going to say it's true because I wouldn't.
Smart man.
Yeah. So she's always right, and we're just going to go with that. But according to her, the reason that was outlawed is because that was a way that people would steal horses back in the day. They would put an ice cream cone in their back pocket, and the horse would follow them, and that's how they would steal someone else's horse. So
I don't even know what to say to that.
I mean, I guess it makes sense, but
I guess so. I mean, if you get to steal a horse, it's worth a dirty pants pocket, right?
I guess. I mean, this is the horse capital of the world, so we got some pretty good thoroughbreds. So I guess, that's $1 million ice cream cone right there. So,
wow,
pretty interesting.
That is interesting.
So
I wonder what other laws are on the books. Maybe we should do a podcast episode on that. Just
strange laws.
Yeah,
that'd be fun. Awesome. All right, well, so let's dive into the creation story.
Okay.
And probably the best way to do that is, every culture has creation stories. I mean, when I was doing some research for this, Native Americans, the Mayans, the Far East, and then of course you've got the Mesopotamian culture, the Egyptian culture, the Hebrews, all have some type of creation stories. And there's a lot of similarities, there's some differences, but it's not, there's not just one creation story. There's actually, multiple ones. But I thought probably the easiest way to start with the Hebrew one is just to have you maybe kind of go through, read a little bit of it, or summarize what we're talking about in Genesis 1.
Okay, yeah. Now I can't read it in Hebrew.
Okay, well, that's fine.
But
I wouldn't understand you anyway.
Yeah, sure. In Genesis 1, I'll be reading from the NIV. It says that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day. And God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault sky, and there was evening and there was morning the second day. And God said, let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear. And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds. And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the third day. And God said, let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years, and let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth. And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern their night. And he also made the stars. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the fourth day. And God said, let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky. So God created the great creatures of the sea, and every living thing with which the water teems, and that moves about in it according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them. And he said, be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the water in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth. And there was evening and there was morning the fifth day. And God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind. And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it, they will be yours for food. And the last two verses read, and to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Matter of fact, let me just go into Genesis 2 here, just read a couple verses. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done.
All right, thank you. So there's some interesting differences between the Hebrew creation story in Genesis 1 and a lot of the others in the different cultures. Now, there's definitely some similarities, but when I was doing some research on this, one of the things that popped up for me was that, obviously, there's one God that created everything. Especially in that region of the world at that time, the Egyptian creation stories, the Sumerian creation stories, there's often multiple gods that are involved in the creation process, and it's usually a very violent kind of ordeal. There's usually some type of battle between deities. Now, from my understanding, this is because you've got a lot of tribal groups coming together to kind of form more of a civilization.
Okay.
So they're each bringing in their gods, and these gods are kind of battling for power, for who's going to be the ultimate god and so forth. So out of this destruction and this violence, you get creations. Limbs become trees and mountains, and humans are kind of made in this process, and it's just kind of byproduct, whatever. Now, this story is very different than that. But there is actually a glimpse in the Bible of the Hebrews actually having a similar myth. And it's actually found in Psalms. And I found this kind of interesting. So let me read this here real quick. So it says, the clearest and fullest biblical account for kind of this ancient myth appears in Psalm 74. For God, thou didst divide the sea by their strength. Thou breakest the heads of the dragons in the water. Thou breakest the heads of Leviathan in pieces, and gavest him to be meat to the people inhabiting the wilderness. Thou didst cleave the fountain and the flood. Thou driest up mighty rivers. The day is thine. Thy night also is thine. Thou hast prepared the light and the sun. Thou hast set all the borders of the earth. Thou hast made summer and winter. That's Psalm 74, 12 through 17. So now there is some debate as to, like, I believe it's considered, Job may be considered the oldest book in the...
That's my understanding.
And Genesis was kind of written a little bit later on. Now, I've also read that maybe Genesis was written during kind of that area of the Babylonian captivity, more when monotheism was becoming a little bit more normal, and this was kind of written to reflect that a little bit.
Yeah.
So, I mean, am I accurate on that, or?
Exactly. That's, again, to my understanding, the best of my knowledge, Genesis 1 and 2 seem more to be like a polemic, an argument that's made to recount the fact that there is one God. As a matter of fact, if you do read it in the Hebrew, the word Elohim, or, God, is used a lot there in Genesis 1. And then he's referred to as Yahweh Elohim in chapter 2. But just the fact that the reiteration that there is one God, he is the Elohim, he is Yahweh, the covenant God of Israel. So it seems to be that way. What you're saying is, it seems to be that Moses and maybe some other authors wrote this as an argument against, the false teaching that there is, or that there are many gods, one for the cattle, one for the field, one for the, reproduction, one for this and that. So to the best of our knowledge, that's what we believe.
Okay. Well, I do find it interesting that it's a contrast compared to the other creation stories. I mean, there are some similarities, but this one is it's not violent. It's very orderly. In fact, each kind of step of the process is good till we get to very good. And what I find really interesting is that the pinnacle of creation is man. So that points to not only one creator of all, that points to a relational God who wants a personal relationship with the pinnacle of his creation, which is man.
Right. Versus man just being a byproduct of a war.
Yes.
Yeah, that's so true. And also, I think it's interesting to know that in chapter 1 there, you have one protagonist. That's God. He's the central theme of that story. But by the time you get to chapter 2, now all of a sudden the author focuses in on how man was created and woman, and how God has put him in the garden. And it's just the story centers, not that God's not the center of the story, because he's the center of the whole Bible, but the story goes from being one character, which is God, to then it focuses in on his creation, the best part of his creation, which is, as you said, humanity.
So, well, I'm glad you brought that up, because a lot of people will use Genesis 2 to argue that, well, there's two different creation stories, and the man and woman was created together in one and different in the second one, and so therefore they try to use it as a way to kind of minimize credibility for the stories. But now, I mean, I've read this over and over as we were preparing for this. I do not see it that way at all. I see kind of a macro, micro kind of approach, and I kept trying to look at it from the other perspective, and I just couldn't find it that way, because I think it's like, okay, here's how we began, but now let's really talk about how man came about.
Yeah, exactly. He takes that day where he made mankind, and it's just like he puts it under the microscope. That's just kind of how I see it too.
Yeah. So that argument doesn't really carry much weight with me the more I read it. However, one argument that does come up a lot, and this seems to be a stumbling block for a lot of people and wanting to believe in God and Christianity, is that 6 days of creation. So God created the world in 6 days. And you'll hear people say 6 24-hour periods versus evolution, which was the earth is billions of years old. The earth is billions of years old. So how do we reconcile that? And so there, you've always had this debate of evolution versus creation. I would like to hear your thoughts. I've got some opinions on this, but I would like to hear your thoughts on kind of that whole debate a little bit.
Yeah. A guy that I like to listen to that I think is very intelligent, his name is Frank Turek, and we've talked about him before. You and I have. Somebody asked him, do you believe in an old earth or a young earth? And his answer was so perfect. Like, I couldn't have said it better myself. He said, on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I'm old earth. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, he said, I'm young earth. And he said, I just take Sunday off to rest, And that's how I feel. At one point, okay, so just to be totally honest with you, when I read the Genesis account, I can't see anything other than 24-hour periods there. Because he even says the evening and the morning were the first day. If you look at Jewish history, or the second day, if you look at Jewish history, you'll find that even when Jesus was crucified, you see that in the story where the day started at 6 p.m. the night before, and then it would end at 6 p.m. the next night. So the evening and the morning, we do morning and evening in our culture, but even the Jewish people did it evening and then morning, and you see that in Genesis 1. So it's right in line with Jewish history. So I can't see anything other than the 24-hour period, but then that still leaves a whole lot of questions, about the age of the earth.
Well, so first of all, I'll just say, I try not to get caught up in the whole 24-hour thing, because if you try to view this story from the scientific perspective that we have for the world today, it's like apples and oranges. It can't be done, because that frame of thought did not exist back then. Right? There wasn't the scientific method and hypothesis and experiment. So that hadn't really come into play yet. This is, and these stories were passed down orally for a period of time long before they were ever actually written out. So the best way for that to occur is through imagery and poetry and a narrative, because you're going to remember a story more than you're just going to remember facts. So I think as they're telling these stories, there's an aspect to it of you've got to kind of line this out in a way that people can understand. So that's kind of my first thought on that. My second thought on it is that God's creating this outside of it. Like, God's outside of time and space and earth and all of that, right? So, his idea of what might be morning and evening could be very different from what he's creating. So, in fact, I don't think it's until, day 3 or 4 that the sun and the moon are created, which is kind of where we get our 24-hour period, right? As the earth spins, on its axis and facing or not facing the sun. That's how, and the Egyptians were, I believe, were the first ones to kind of use 12 increments on the sundial. So, I think trying to say, well, if you're spending all your time making that argument that it's 24 hours, you're missing
something much bigger. Yeah.
So definitely something much bigger in the story, because, and I think some of the things that you might miss on that is when I was reading this, one of the things that really jumped out to me, and at the end of this kind of episode, I want to kind of go through and just have us each say kind of what this story means to us personally. But I see in this first chapter in Genesis, I see the first glimpse of the Trinity.
Okay.
Because it talks about, God created it all. It talks about his spirit hovering over the waters. And he spoke creation into existence. And we know from the first chapter of John, verse 1, that in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word is God. That's in reference to Jesus. So I think you have God, you have his Spirit, and you have Jesus all mentioned right there in Genesis chapter 1. Mm-hmm. So I think that is the first glimpse of the Trinity in the Bible.
Absolutely. Matter of fact, when God made man, he said, let us make man in our image. So I think you're right on.
And there's a whole podcast probably there on monotheism and polytheism and all of that. But yeah. So to me, I think the whole, well, and there's something interesting too I came across when I was looking at this, when God says, let there be light. What I find interesting, he doesn't create light. He says, let there be light. Now, I think you can make an argument that God is light. Jesus said he is the light of the world. When people, for example, have an out-of-body experience or a death experience, you often hear them say they were being drawn to the light. What I find interesting about light is that apparently, now I don't know a lot about physics. I went to college, but I'm not studying physics a whole lot. If you reach the speed of light, time stops. Time ceases to exist at the speed of light. So the theory is if you could travel at the speed of light, you would essentially time would no longer exist. So if 200 years down here would pass, if you're traveling at the speed of light, 0 time would pass. However, the closer you get to the speed of light, your mass increases and you begin to slow down. So you can never actually, as of right now anyway, you can never actually reach the speed of light, which I find interesting. So if God is light, we're never going to be able to fully grasp what that is. We're never going to understand the Bible says, my ways are not your ways, my thoughts are not your thoughts. And I think he even says right there in Job, like, where were you when I created all this? You don't know. You're kind of guessing here. So I don't think we're truly ever going to know the answer of this until we're with God. So most of what we're doing here is trying to take this and do the best we can with it. But again, I come back to the argument. If you're getting caught up in these arguments, then you're kind of missing the whole point of the story.
Yeah.
So, but now they've tried to reconcile this a little bit, I believe. So there's something called the gap theory.
I've heard of that.
Well, why don't you tell me a little bit about what that is?
Yeah. Well, the gap theory is just that. It's a theory. And it's based on the fact that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And verse 2 says, the earth was formless and empty. So in between verses 1 and 2, and you'll also find there in verse 2, the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. So God, when he made the heavens and the earth, now all of a sudden you have water. Well, how is that possible? So there must have been something that happened to cause water to be over the whole earth, is one of the thoughts. So there is a gap of time where something has happened in between verses 1 and 2, which they would say, well, maybe that explains the old earth that science is telling us, is scientific fact today. So that's called the gap theory because there was a gap of time, they believe, in between verses 1 and 2. Now, I have some thoughts about this, but I think before I share those, I would like to hear yours first.
Yeah, I find this theory interesting a little bit. And I think the only way this theory truly makes sense is if you're 100% trying to take this literally as creation being 6 24-hour periods. I mean, because I don't know how I feel about that. Yeah, I look at this story from a whole different perspective, and we'll kind of get to that at the end, my perspective on it. But I think it's hard. I'm probably going to offend all these gap theorists, but so to me, because now here's my understanding of it. Right, there's in this gap. That's when you have Satan rebels and his angels, and there's like a war in heaven. and essentially Satan gets kind of kicked out of heaven, comes down to earth, and basically the earth becomes desolate and catastrophic and all this. And apparently this is when the dinosaurs were around, and there's all kinds of like things that have kind of come out of this gap.
So there was also mankind that existed before Adam and Eve, and God wiped them out, and that's where the water comes from, because there was a first flood.
Yes,
before the flood of Noah. So
now, see, I think the like from a metaphorical standpoint, if you look at, I think water is associated with, especially in ancient times, with kind of being the void, the abyss, if you will. So I mean, I kind of look at it from a different. I think this is trying to put a square peg in a round hole. If you ask me, I think it's hey, we got to make this fit somehow, and let's come up with. I mean, it just seems kind of man-made to me a little bit, and that's just my opinion.
Yeah, I think it is. And really, what you're doing is you're basing a theory on silence. The Bible is completely silent about this, so you're going to make a theory. You're going to say stuff. I mean, that's literally reading between the lines, right? So the Bible doesn't say this. So this is what we think happened. Wait a second. The Bible didn't even take time to tell you what happened. There may have been nothing. There may have been nothing there. It's just what the Bible says. So it's trying to posit a bunch of events that happen between these verses based on something the Bible isn't saying, which I think is kind of a weird notion.
Yeah, I mean, the question has been there for, everybody from the beginning of time. How did we get here? What does it mean? All of that. And I think science has shown us that by dating fossils and dating this, that the earth is this old and the universe is this old. And so we've got to find a way to make this fit. And so a bunch of smart people got in a room and came up with an idea. That's just my opinion of it. I don't know. I don't really buy it. I think it's a little bit far out there for me. Could be true. I don't know.
That's why it's a theory.
Right.
Not a fact. Yeah. So I don't think it's something that you should teach as like gospel truth. It's fun to entertain the thought, but there's a lot of things that's fun to entertain, to speculate. It's just mere speculation.
Well, so what do you say to someone who tells you like, this just doesn't, I believe in evolution. This just doesn't, I just can't grasp this. Like, what's your answer? If someone says this, like I'm really struggling with this. I want to believe in God. I want to be a Christian, but I really have a hard time reconciling this. What would you say to them?
Well, the truth is there are a lot of scientists that I don't think we hear about from mainstream media that are also believers in Christ. And they've been able to reconcile it. Of course, we don't hear it from that perspective. So it doesn't mean they have all the answers, but there are scientists that believe in an old earth. There are scientists who study the sciences, biology and everything from chemistry to, all the sciences. There's a vast array of them, and there are some that still believe in a young earth. They're scientists, but they're also believers in Christ. So there are people out there that have come to terms with, you can have both, the struggle, young earth, old earth, and still believe in God. So I would probably defer to them. I know that there's like BioLogos is one organization. They're Christians, and they have some good stuff on their website, but yet they believe in an old earth. Then you have like Answers in Genesis right here in northern Kentucky, who they're scientists and they believe in a young earth. But okay, so they see that differently, but they still have a common denominator, and that is Christ. So you don't have to have the answers to these questions in order to be a Christ follower.
Well, yeah, and I think even if you look at it from, let's say you just can't logically make the leap. You can't say, okay, I believe this was 6 24-hour periods or whatever. I see this more as a metaphorical story or this imagery poetry that was helped to relay this kind of story. Just because something may be presented as fiction doesn't mean it's a lie. It doesn't mean it's false. there's a lot of great truths that have been revealed through fiction throughout history. I mean, some of the best, most classic literature that we've studied in high school and college and all of that were fictional stories, but they were based on some very, moral truths. And
Jesus himself used parables,
absolutely,
fictional stories to tell of real life principles. So.
Yeah. Well, so that kind of brings me to this part. Like when you, as Pastor Jamison, when you read this Genesis chapter 1, like what does it mean to you? How do you apply it to your life? Like when you're peeling back the onion of this story?
Well, to be very real with you, and maybe this is, shame on me kind of thing, but I can't say that I've really, I've read the creation story many times, but to say that I've studied it to the point where I was looking for something deeper there, I can't say that I did that a lot over the years. And just as a Christian, even in ministry, it wasn't until just recently that you and I had been talking, just over even the past few years, you and I have talked, and a lot of these questions have come up. And even more recent than that, in studying for this podcast, the question was really put to me from really just the thought that I had was, what does this convey to my life personally, more than just being a story about where we came from, which I think is important to know that we came from God. But I think I have learned, and I'm still learning, and there's probably a lot to unpack here that we'll never fully realize, as you've already stated. But it's just a reminder to me, and we need to get into the whole chaos and order conversation, and maybe we'll do that on our next episode, because that's really what stuck out to my mind, how in the scripture, not just in creation, but throughout the Bible, you have chaos, then you have God speak his word and bring order to a situation. Then his people will rebel. Now they've created chaos again. Then God will send a prophet or send his law, something, a spoken word, right, that will bring order again to their situation. Then generations pass, and next thing you know, they're rebelling again. They've forgotten the word that has brought peace and prosperity to them. Now they've entered into chaos again. And when I look at my own life, I kind of feel like that's something that I've seen. Like God will do something for me, and I'm just like happy. He'll speak to a situation in my life, and he'll bring peace, and he'll bring order to it. Well, then in a short time later, whether it's days, weeks, months, whatever the case may be, I've kind of getting out in my own line of thinking and trying to fix things on my own. Maybe I'll sin against God, do something that I know his word says I shouldn't do as a Christ follower, and I'll create chaos in my life again. Whether it's chaos in the situations around me, or whether it's as simple as having chaos in my spirit because I'm not at peace. And then I'll have to go back to God. He'll forgive me, give me a word, speak his word into my life that will bring order back to my life. So as we've been studying this in preparation for this podcast, it has made me look at my own life. And even as a pastor, I see this in the life of the church, many people in the church. There's chaos, and then there's order. But because we're humans, we create chaos again. Then God will speak and give order. Then at some point, we'll rebel and create chaos. So there's always a need for God to give peace and order to our situations. If it's left up to us, we will always create chaos. Always. But God will always then interject himself, if we will ask him to and allow him to, and bring order back to the things we've messed up.
Pretty good. It's pretty good stuff. Because mine's very similar to that. I think as I go through this story, and I look at it, like, okay, how can I apply this to my daily life? Like, one of the things that I see is that chaos and order. But I think you start when you find yourself in chaos, which you're going to at some point, whether it's self-induced or not, you're going to find yourself in some type of chaos. And when you're in that abyss, when you're, the world has no shape or form for you at that point. What I find interesting in the creation story is one of the first things. Well, the first thing to notice is that God's Spirit is always there. It's always hovering, right? So, and then the next thing that he says, the first thing he does is says, "Let there be light," right? That to me is there's always going to be some hope. You've got to trust that light. You got to trust that hope. And then the second thing is he starts to speak. He doesn't think it. He doesn't raise his hand, build it. He speaks creation. So that tells me there's power in words. There's not only power in God's words, but there's power in my words. I can create with my words. I can also destroy with my words. So I have to be very careful about the words I'm speaking, not only to others, but into my own mind, to make sure I'm thinking right. And the other thing I find really interesting is that each step of the way in this creation story, each day and evening, right, he kind of stops to critique it a little bit. And he says, it's good, or it's very good. So as I'm moving through my life and I'm trying to make sure that I'm speaking creative words into others or to myself, but I also need to check along the way. Like, am I still moving towards something that's good? Or have I kind of wandered off the path and I need to then get back on track and move towards what's good? And I think this formula can follow for everything you do throughout your life when you find yourself in chaos and you need to create order. And to me, that's what I take out of this story. And it's not just about, this is how God created the world and the world, and this is how man came about. There's some applicable lessons in this that you can use on a day-to-day basis if you really look at the formula that God uses to pull order out of chaos.
You know, God said everything was good all the way through chapter 1. It was good, it was good, it was good. Then he saw that Adam was alone, and he's like, this is not good. It is not good for man to be alone. And I say that as an unmarried man. I have no idea what that means right now. I just wanted to bring that up.
Well, I would say that it's a good thing to have.
Good. I put that on a tee for you. You better hit a home run with it. So.
Absolutely. But you know what? I think that's a great comment, though, because as we move into the next part of the creation story with Adam and Eve and the garden and the tree of knowledge, which will be the next episode, I think that's a great stopping point for this episode, so we can then dive into that part of the story in the next episode. So,
looking forward to it.
Sounds good.
All right.